Welcome. We still have some people joining us, and we'll get started here in just a moment. I'm Lori Mulberg. I'll be hanging out in the background here, helping out with the meeting today. And I'll take care of a few just housekeeping items before we get started. So just to let you all know, this meeting is being recorded, and we'll share the recording and the slides after the session. So you'll get that by email from me, probably later today. As always, keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking, and that will just improve the audio quality for everyone else. And if you have a question or an idea to share, feel free to type it into the chat, and you'll find that usually by toggling over the bottom of your screen. You can see the little chat icon, and our moderators will handle sort of drawing questions out from chat as throughout the evening or throughout the meeting today. For those of you who are interested in continuing education, this session is eligible for one AIA learning unit. You must attend the full session or a minimum of 60 minutes in order to qualify for that learning unit. Others might be interested in receiving a certificate. If you requested those during your registration, I'll be sharing those with you within the next week, probably before the end of this week. And credits will be reported to AIA soon after. So if you have any questions or if you forgot to add that and you are interested, feel free to just reply to my email after the event and let me know. Moving on, I'll introduce our series host today. Virajita Singh will be our discussion host today. She's the Associate Vice Provost for the Office of Equity and Diversity at the University of Minnesota. And she's also a Senior Research Fellow with our Center for Sustainable Building Research. For our chat moderation today, Abby Asojo and Tom Fisher will be serving in that role. Abby is our Associate Dean for Research, Creative Scholarship, and Engagement, and a Professor of Interior Design. And Tom Fisher is a former Dean of our College of Design, Director of the Minnesota Design Center, and a Dayton Hudson Chair in Urban Design. Our featured guests today are teeing up the conversation. We have Teresa Moses. She is a creative director for Blackbird Revolt, and she's also the assistant professor of graphic design and the director of our Design Justice program here at the College of Design. And Mary Margaret Zindran, executive director and executive vice president of the American Institute of Architects, Minnesota. And you may see bio links to learn a little more about our speakers in the chat. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Virajita, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Lori, and welcome everyone. I think some of you have come to many of our other sessions, the Design for Post-Pandemic World Series. What we do in this series is come together to talk about what we're experiencing during this global disruption that has gone through many phases. We use this conversation to co-imagine a post-pandemic future. And mainly we focus on design as a platform to identify ways to support positive change through new types of collaborations and design solutions. And finally, we want to spark new ways of thinking about design in our lives and organizations. So a little bit about today's schedule. I don't know if it's on the next slide. Yes. So our agenda today is to focus on design in the context of equity and justice. And we'll start with this is the overview. We will move on next to the topic introduction and presentations by our speakers. And then we'll return for a full group discussion where we'll share our ideas, questions, and insights. And we welcome you to use the chat at any time. We'll be monitoring and facilitate the conversation. And then we'll end with some closing remarks from our presenters, and the program will end at 1:45. So with that, I'm going to pass the presentation first to Mary Margaret Zindran. Thank you.
It helps if I unmute. Are you able to see the slide deck that I have up? Yes, Parajda?
Yes, we
very
can.
good. Okay, thanks so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this session. Again, I'm Mary Margaret Zindran. I have the pleasure of serving as the EVP and Executive Director of AI Minnesota. I'm glad to see a number of our members in the audience today. I'm going to lay out a couple of major initiatives that we have going on with AI Minnesota that relate to equity and justice in design as a profession and in the built environment. I'm going to start with an overview of our culture change initiative. This is a program that really focuses on examining the current culture of the profession of architecture, defining the desired culture of the profession, and determining what it will take to accelerate change from where we are today, or where we were pre-pandemic, and where we want to head. I know this series is really put together in the context of the pandemic, and one of the things that our core team found, and I should note Elizabeth Turner, who's in the audience today, is a member of that core team that worked for several years on this culture change initiative. We did considerable primary research and secondary research. One of our core findings is that culture change is possible now, and it is more possible now than when we embarked on this culture change initiative before the pandemic. Systems theory really tells us that destabilization of a system makes it more susceptible and more amenable to change. And over the past few years, there have been 4 profoundly destabilizing forces building upon each other to make now the right time for us to be leading change in the culture of the profession of architecture. The first of those was the Me Too movement, and that had firm leaders and clients doing more to identify and address barriers that hinder the success of women in their careers. The second major force is the nation's current reckoning with systemic racism, which has brought to the fore concerns about the practices, structures, and culture that make the profession make it difficult within the profession to attract and retain people of color in architecture, and also get in the way of creating equitable and just design solutions. Third is the rise of climate change as a societal and client priority. And fourth is the pandemic, which forced the profession of architecture to adopt remote work approaches and flexible hours, and to really recognize the challenges faced by caregivers. The fact that the entire profession made a shift to remote work almost overnight and has sustained this way of working for many, many months, and is now poised for a hybrid future. This has created an unprecedented opportunity to reshape our thinking around where, when, and how we work. And it lays the foundation for broader systems change as well. It really is a once in a generation opportunity for both systems change and culture change. And it's of course important to note that these destabilizing forces are overlapping and intersectional in nature, and they affect both the profession and the built environment. The pandemic, of course, has had deeper impacts on women, still tending to carry significantly more of the caregiving burden than men. People of color being more susceptible to severe health impacts from this particular pandemic and other potential future pandemics due to the health issues tied to systemic racism in healthcare and generational poverty. And climate change, of course, is a contributor to both the creation and the dispersion of novel coronaviruses like COVID-19, and has had disproportionate impacts on people of color. So while this culture change initiative is focused on the profession of architecture, it's clear that these same destabilizing forces are already changing the desires of clients and the design solutions that will best protect the public health, safety, and welfare going forward. One of the things I wanted to call your attention to today in this vein is a compelling article published a couple of days ago in Architect Magazine that was written by one of our members, James Garrett Jr., a founding partner at Formula and an AI Minnesota Gold Medal winner. He also makes the case that the convergence of the pandemic and this reckoning around systemic racism has the potential to create truly dramatic change in society and in the work of architecture. And we'll put that link in the chat for you. One of the other things that we found in our research is that the reckoning around systemic racism and the pandemic and carryover from the Me Too movement have changed what it means for a firm to be well positioned for success. The firms that we believe are going to be most successful are those whose demographics reflect the population that they are serving. Those that have strong partnerships with women-owned and BIPOC-owned firms. Those where members of the team have strong intercultural skills, ability to bridge across difference, and strong collaboration skills. Firms where they have embraced flexible and outcomes-based approaches. And from a pure foundational skill set perspective, being able to not only understand, but apply concepts around climate-oriented design and equitable design. A lot of people talk about equitable design, but there is a great need for shared meaning around those terms, and a great need for examples of equitable design to be shared and analyzed, and lessons learned brought forward. We also have identified in our work the culture that we're aiming for. And we boil that down to these three core elements, not just equitable culture, but also one that is authentic and collaborative. And we go in our other presentations on this initiative into much greater depth on what is meant by authentic, equitable, and collaborative. But this slide gives you a general sense of what we mean here. The key concept, though, is that culture really is built every day. It's through those individual interactions, those everyday decisions. That's what creates the culture within which the profession operates. What I wanted to most bring your attention to today is our work to really think about how we change this culture. And we've really taken a systems thinking approach to this, one that applies the leverage points approach of Donella Meadows. And I'm not going to go into each element of the leverage points analysis, but overall to understand that as you move closer to leverage points like rules and goals and mindsets, small shifts have a greater potential to change a system, to change a culture, than actions that are closer to the fulcrum. Unfortunately, most systems interventions are designed around that first leverage point of constants, parameters, and numbers. And that is a leverage point where it takes a lot of resources, extraordinary effort in order to tip the system and create change. And this is why we recognize that, for example, in the profession of architecture, our work cannot simply be focused on bringing in new members of the profession and having those individuals be more representative of the demographics of the public. The system that they are being brought into needs to change in order for the culture change that we're seeking to occur. So in other words, pipeline efforts are crucial, but they are not enough. The change that is needed here is really about the people currently within the system and the processes and rules and mindsets that they have brought into that system and baked into their current approaches. It really is a matter of integrity. If we're going to recruit people into this system, we also have to ensure that there's a strong chance for everyone to thrive within it. Our work is also focused on identifying the mindsets currently in play within the system of architecture, the mindsets that underlie all other aspects of the system. We have worked to identify a wide range of mindsets, and in each case, we've identified a mindset that, on balance, we believe accelerates us toward the culture that we're seeking, that which is authentic, collaborative, and equitable, and a paired mindset that, on balance, hinders the creation of that desired culture. This is one example of the mindsets that we have identified here. A hindering mindset being a focus on individual achievement as primary, the hero architect. And then the pair to that, the mindset that we believe will accelerate the desired culture is one where collaboration is primary, and team recognition, team focus is where we need to be putting our emphasis. And finally, in looking to accelerate the pace of change that we are poised to create, that we have this moment, really that we can take advantage of from these converging forces, we need to recognize that culture change cannot simply be directed. It's not something that the head of a firm or head of a school of architecture can simply say, we are going to change this culture in this way. It has to be something that is cultivated throughout the system, and each of us has a role to play, no matter where we are within the system hierarchically, no matter what skill sets we bring to the table. There is a place for us in the work of culture change. It is very much a work of cultivation, and this comes from complexity theory, where the seeding of new ideas and new people into the system, the nurturing of the context within which they are working and the supports that are available, the weeding out, the removing of barriers, and sometimes of people who are hindering progress toward that desired culture and those outcomes. And then the harvesting of being able to celebrate and spotlight the actions and outcomes that are aligned with the culture that we're seeking, and learning from experiments and adjusting based on what we learn. These are all interrelated. They're not linear in nature, all need to be happening at the same time for that cultivation of change to really take hold and bear fruit. To this end, we've created a community of practice where members of AI Minnesota and others in the AAC community in Minnesota, as well as practitioners across the country, are coming together to do pattern spotting, where they identify a pair of mindsets and observe their environments and observe how the systems within which they work, whether it's a firm or a school of architecture or another workplace, how that mindset is showing up within that system, documenting that, They've shared their observations with others within the community of practice, and we are now starting to develop and experiment with interventions in the system, being very mindful of those leverage points and where we can have greatest impact. And this community of practice is something that is open to anyone who is committed to creating this authentic, equitable, and collaborative culture. And I welcome any questions or thoughts if folks are interested in joining this community of practice. The other thing I want to briefly bring to your attention is a project we've been working on for the past 6 years in collaboration with the Minnesota Design Center, the Center for Sustainable Building Research, both of those with the U of M, and Brian Lee Jr. out of Collocate in New Orleans. This 21st century development framework is designed to accelerate the pace of change from our standard way of implementing development, implementing design processes, and move us further, faster toward regenerative design and development solutions. Within this framework, we've leveraged the 7 petals of the International Living Building Challenge, and within them identified what constitutes standard, good, better living and regenerative levels, as well as where one might hit a barrier along the way, a financial barrier, a policy barrier, really showing that there's often significant running room before a project might hit a truly significant barrier. We are working right now with a number of business owners, neighborhood groups, community groups, civic leaders to bring this framework to the fore and to later this summer actually hold some workshops that focus on the equity performance area in particular, and introduce concepts around equitable development to the broad public and many stakeholders, and help them start applying these principles and this framework to the projects that they have underway in the areas affected in the unrest following the murder of George Floyd. So I welcome you to be looking out for those. Knowing some of the folks on the call here, I expect that you'll likely get an invitation to participate. Paul Bachnight is our collaborator in this. He's also someone affiliated with the Minnesota Design Center and the Center for Transformative Urban Design. So there's much work to do in these realms, and we are very much working to apply this framework in our local communities. To close out, I just wanted to note some of the questions that we are asking, and I encourage you all to be asking. Of the profession, the question, what experiences, perspectives, skills, and areas of knowledge would be valued on design teams if equity and justice were prioritized in design and development? And really think about how that might change who we think of as a promising architect or designer, and how it might change the composition of our design teams. And in the built environment, how can we better prepare architects and design professionals to identify inequities in the systems of the built environment and inequities related to a particular project? And then once identified, what are the leverage points within the system that design teams can use in addressing those inequities? So I'll close it out there and stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Teresa.
Thank you, Mary Margaret, and welcome, Teresa.
Hello, everyone. So thank you so much for that, Mary Margaret. I feel like I'm kind of answering some of those questions that you had at the end, but we're going to move into talking about a toolkit that myself and my colleague have worked on to actually help folks understand racialized design and then use design interventions to create anti-racist approaches. And then I'll run through some case studies as well. So again, my name is Teresa, I use she, her pronouns, and this is Racism Untaught. So myself and my colleague, Lisa Mercer, she is at the University of Illinois. We created this toolkit for one reason is because we continue to get questions from other faculty who were interested to know why or how we were able to talk about racism in a design classroom. A lot of folks think that it is very difficult. It is a very hard topic, but we decided to, brainstorm because all of our projects, everything that we do, the foundation is going to be on anti-racism. So it came kind of like second nature for us. We're like, how can we create something that other folks would be able to use to help them have opportunity to talk about racism as well? So the toolkit itself is just used to help understand racialized design, find out what elements of racism are, and then be able to solve for that in using an anti-racist design approach. So when we talk about racism, a very short definition for that is going to be prejudice plus power over. And so this is how we have defined it using our toolkit. Racism as the conscious or subconscious belief and or action that supports the social construct of race as a primary determinant of human capacities, and that the most predominant race is inherently superior. We have run a lot of workshops, internationally. So there are, again, a lot of nuance when we talk about racism within other countries.
My apologies. I couldn't hear.
Sorry, Siri thought I was saying something, but, but when we talk about the US, this context, we're talking specifically about white people over the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So racialized design, how we've defined it is just any form of design that perpetuates elements of racism. And what we've done is we've defined it in 3 categories. So these are just 3 examples for you. The 3 categories are artifacts, systems, and experiences. And anything that, we experience or, has been designed, basically everyone is a designer in some capacity. And so here we've defined an artifact. This is an example of a mascot from the University of Illinois that was retired back in 2007. However, is still very prominent on campus. And so here's an example of an artifact. A system, Mary Margaret kind of already mentioned this too, about, the pandemic really sort of highlighting the disparities that exist, especially within our healthcare system. But one of those that we see, especially as educators, is, digital technology. And, what does digital redlining mean for our communities? How are people getting educated? And we're seeing that a lot through the pandemic, and how, it was kind of exacerbated because of the pandemic. And then lastly, in experience, so artifact, system, experience, this third one being about a cultural appropriation. And so being, using cultural aspects like, AAVE, Black vernacular, and how those things are only seen as okay, on white people or white bodies. I like to quote Antoinette Carroll here. She is the director, creator of Creative Reaction Lab. And she says, like all systems of oppression, inequality, and inequity are by design. Therefore, they can be redesigned. And so we like to use this as a way to motivate folks, because oftentimes when we talk about racism, folks just go away feeling bad. Either you have guilt or you're like, man, the world is just horrible, right? And so we like to use the workshops as an opportunity to not only recognize the racialized design, but like I said before, start to create anti-racist design approaches. So I think that gives folks a little bit more hope as we're talking about things that can change. So the toolkit itself is using the design research process. We've altered it just a bit. So that first step, sometimes it's called empathy. what we've came to the conclusion of is that empathy will come. However, just finding out context will help folks move through that. And your empathy comes with building relationships with other folks. So we can't depend on that as the way that we're going to, redesign. So we've renamed it context, understanding that, moving into the define phase, which is like your research, your thesis question, all that. The third phase being ideate, where folks are really beginning to create ideas, prototyping, the making of those ideas, and then impact, which is sometimes called test on the design research process, and we've changed it to impact so that we can begin to measure impact rather than testing on populations. We're actually trying to see what positive impact we're making rather than just having, good intent. So here's what the toolkit looks like, like what you would see in person. The workboard itself is about 5 feet long and 3 feet high. And you can see that design research process that I showed a close-up of just a slide ago here as part of the toolkit itself. And then you have sort of these interventions that are happening on each step. And I can talk through this a little bit more if there's more time at the end if folks would like that. But on the first step, what you'll notice there is a systems of oppression map. And so what that does is after folks have contextualized their prompt, their racist prompt or racialized design prompt, they're able to then, dissect it into, how does that prompt show up in personal beliefs? How does it show up in agentic action? How is it supported by our institutions? And then, how is that reflected in culture? So you kind of, see each of these steps, and we kind of have similar design interventions. Each step has a set of cards. That's what you're seeing there on the left-hand side. And I'm happy to say too that we have expanded our kit right now to have elements of sexism and elements of ableism. So that is something that is coming. Okay, and I'm going to show you some examples of what the workboard looks like. This is the workboard used in a 16-week semester. And you see the design prompt up there, and these are what the student groups used. And this is what it looks like at the end. And because of the pandemic, we've had to change our way of using the toolkit to digital form. So we use Mural as the interface, and then we have digitized all of the elements here and the workboard. So it provides an opportunity to do workshops across the nation and internationally, which is pretty awesome. I'll say we work with a lot of higher ed institutions to run this training, but also right now we're working with some pretty large organizations who are reworking their design processes. So folks like Target and Apple, PayPal, Spotify are folks that are working with us to really focus on an anti-racist lens through their design processes. And so here's what a working example looks like. In our workshops, we like to give an example, and because I'm here in Minneapolis, I've used the George Floyd example, throughout the whole pandemic. And so this is what a workboard looks like digitally once we've finished it. And this could be a 16-week semester or an 8-hour workshop. Okay, so now I'm gonna run into some case studies so folks can begin to see what it looks like when folks are creating, products and other design artifacts through the toolkit. All right, so Aunt Jemima, who has since decided to rebrand themselves, I assigned this project to students back when we first started the toolkit back in 2018. And students were looking at Aunt Jemima, that archetype, and understanding why it was problematic and why it existed for almost 100 years and it's still in the store. And so students were able to contextualize, this racialized design. So in the deck of cards, in the context, they could pull things out like microaggression or anti-Black racism or misogynoir. And they begin to pull all these elements of racism out and then consider how they can begin to create an anti-racist approach. I really liked what they came up with. So in the center there, you see a transition packaging. What they were trying to address by making a transition package is, one, the racism that Aunt Jemima had been perpetuating. But two, what they were trying to also tackle was the fact that a lot of organizations, when they are accused of doing something that is racialized, they just make a tweet about it or they'll send out an email. And so what the students were thinking, well, how can we make more of an impact? So remember that word is super heavy here. How can we make more of an impact so that everybody knows that we understand we were perpetuating racism for 100+ years? And so they were like, we need to have it on the package. And so they remove Aunt Jemima, and then they have, a little sarcastic thing here, but it draws your eye and it allows people to understand, hey, let's talk about like the history of this packaging. And then the last example here on the right, that's their final package, and they've rebranded it, calling it Yours Truly, because it's no longer a Black woman cooking for you in the kitchen, it is you. Another example, a group was working on Uncle Ben's, similar to Aunt Jemima. You have this archetype of the, Black enslaved person, working in the kitchen for their masters. And so again, these students decided to use the same concept of a transition packaging, removing Uncle Ben's face and calling it and saying Uncle Who, and then being able to have some verbiage on the back that talks about the what it was perpetuating. And then the final packaging here being called Quite Frankly, because the person who the image Uncle Ben was modeled after, their first name is Frank. And so they decided to pay homage to that, but also be very creative, I think, on saying like, it's just rice. Like there is no Uncle Ben's, there's no, it's just rice. It's very frank and to the point. So very smart example here, I think. With all of the projects for that I run with students, we have them create a huge booklet that goes through their whole process and what they've created. So this is just a screenshot of what that is, but you can also view some of this on our website as well at racismuntaught.com. These students here were assigned Yellow Belly. So Yellow Belly is it was kind of, I think it was a part of a contest, but they were given, they were trying to point to the fact that folks who are, part of the KKK are, have yellow bellies, which is another way of saying like they are cowardice. However, that is an old saying that a lot of even, especially all the students didn't even know what that meant. There's a lot of folks in the community who they interviewed who didn't know what that meant. And so remember, we talked about intent over impact. So the intention was very good. They're trying to call to like, cowardly folks. However, the impact landed very wrong. And so students were looking, they were able to dissect and again, contextualize, okay, impact over intent, or intent over impact. That was a card that they pulled up for as they were contextualizing. And so they said, a better way for us to do it is to think about, they decided to use the technology where you put something in cold water and you start to begin to see a new image. And so they were like, so on here, if you can't see on the bottle, it says, do you know what's going on in your own backyard? So the beer, they renamed it Backyard. And so you'll see, you won't see the, it's an example of police brutality here, but you'll see the blue car on the regular, packaging that you find in the store. But then once you cool it down and you have it in the refrigerator for a while, then it begins to show a scene of what's going on in your backyard. So it's a very, again, trying to point to the fact that racism isn't just folks, who have a KKK hood. They wanted to, bring it to the fact that racism is all around us in our own backyards. So I thought that was a pretty smart design. Here, I'm sure we can, based on the examples that I've already talked about, we can kind of see why this is already problematic, using Indigenous imagery to sell a soda. So this is called Cherokee Red, and what students decided to do is create something that, one, honored some traditions of Indigenous folks, however, pointing to the land as one of those things that we need to honor. And so you'll see some of that in the design work and some of the imagery. And then also what's not shown here is that students were thinking, okay, then where does the money go? And so they were like, all right, what indigenous tribes and nations can this money go to? So when we sell in certain areas, we'll have percentages of that going to those specific nations. So as a way of reparations. So students really get to, think really deeply about not just the design aspect, but then all of that impact and that comes after. And again, everyone, has to create the huge booklet. So, again, feel free to view some of that stuff online. Just this past semester, I had students looking at Miss Buttersworth for some of the same reasons that we've already talked about. They renamed it Queens and really trying to uplift and empower Black women. They had a set of trading cards that go with it to inform folks about different queens. And yeah, I thought it was a really, really great response to the racialized design of Mrs. Buttersworth. And then again, they have a design research book as well. I also had another group looking at cream of wheat. And so they were able to think about, what are we actually trying to say with this? Of course, removing the iconography there, or the archetype, and then also creating a deck of cards, which folks can begin to collect to understand Black history a bit better. I really liked what they were thinking about with what does the product look like on the shelves? And so I included a screenshot of that as well. Again, the booklet. Eskimo Pie, students were able to look at, they actually have rebranded as well, just this past year. But students were thinking about, okay, what are we trying to think about when we think about Eskimo Pie, and if we and why that word is problematic. And so they began to think and focus on what's actually found again in the land that would be in the very cold north. So they began to think about animals and different landscapes, and that's what you'll see here. Again, they have a booklet as well. And this last semester as well, we looked at Trader Joe's taco shelves, and Trader Joe's has these different brands for different types of food, which is kind of another way of othering. This one here is called Trader Jose's. Trader Jose's has like all of these Latinx foods. And so that's already problematic. You're othering in the store, in the grocery store. But what students were focused on is the fact that these are not actually authentic tacos. They're a very colonized version, right? And so students were like, okay, so that's why you see, their tagline, not for tacos, because it's not taco shells. And they renamed it altogether, and they're calling it a crispy corn shell rather than a taco, because that is not a taco, authentic taco. And so they also have some homage to Latinx folks that's there on the inside of the packaging. And then you can also use the QR code, scan that, and it'll bring you to their app. So they did a really wonderful job, I think, of thinking about the impact. Again, their booklet. This one here, I'm sure most folks have heard of Robert Moses, an architect who basically built like the systems and how we do public transportation, also known as a very incredibly racist and sexist person. And so some of the bridges that were built in cities, New York to be have one example here, but has been modeled around a whole bunch of places in the nation. Robert Moses decided to make bridges low enough so that public transportation couldn't get through to certain areas of the city. As I'm talking, I'm probably sure you understand how problematic that can be. Black and brown communities, low income communities were not able to get to certain parts of the city, perpetuating segregation. And so what students did here is they decided to say, okay, we're going to talk about the bridges and get folks to understand how hard it is to get from one place of the city to the other, based on a set of cards. And what it began to become is a game about privilege. So, pulling cards, allowed you to move certain areas or not move. And so you really got to think about, what it's like to live in other people's shoes. So some close-up shots. And then that former mascot, this is an exhibition that was created from some grad students. So we have run it with corporate entities, undergrad students, and graduate students, and came up with some really amazing results here. So this was a experiential exhibit on the mascot at the University of Illinois. And that is it. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you, Mary Margaret. What incredible work and ideas so far. You know, it's really inspiring. I think what both of you have pointed out is the power of design, because we are looking to create futures, create worlds, create physical objects. And yet this work of equity looks back also to the past, and some of the projects you were showing, Teresa, really to embody that. You know, take a look at the past critically, but then bring all that creativity that the students were showing into creating futures. So as people are thinking about their questions, I hope you'll put them in chat, but I wanted to ask you both about a question related to your work. Both your work seems to be very much about understanding the system and also engaging it in the transformation. So what are you seeing on the ground, if you will, of how people are responding to it? And I mean people of all identities, right, that are engaged in this work. Just give us a sense of that, and then we'll move into the group discussion.
Teresa, I defer to you to go first if you'd like.
Please,
All right.
please go ahead, go first.
All right, I'm in, okay. So I would say that this systems thinking approach to creating culture change in the profession has been really well received by a wide array of folks, from firm leaders and former CEOs to students and people who are new to the profession, people of all demographics. I think in part because architects are taught to be systems thinkers. So it's applying a realm of knowledge that they've gained in their education and over time, but in a new way, and in a way that allows them to start to realize that not all actions are the same in terms of their potential impact. I really appreciate what Teresa brought forward in intent versus impact. That by focusing more on the system and systems change, it I think gets people more cued into impact. You have to be thinking about how the rules of the system, if changed, would lead to a particular impact versus changing the goals of the system or information flows. So it requires you to go into that space of impact, and impact on whom, for whom.
So yeah, to answer the question, I would say we're talking about racism. So you're going to have hesitation with folks, you know, as much as we try to make things as accessible as possible with using the toolkit. There's a lot of folks who are nervous, and that's understandable. But like we tell, you know, folks, especially during a workshop, is that this should not be the only moment that you're thinking about anti-racism in your work. This might be the beginning, this might have been the start, and that's okay too, wherever you're at, but you need to, you know, come on. So I would say, you know, students receive it pretty well. I've had some problematic students who, you know, question me on every turn, and what I like to actually call it was defending whiteness at every turn. And so what I had to do was begin to answer with questions so that the student was not depending on me to answer, you know, be the all-knowing person about racism, but they had to begin to discover for themselves. And then those questions became less and less throughout the semester. But there is definitely some defensiveness that I experience, and that might be because of the identities that I hold as well, leading these workshops and leading the classroom. I would say the workshops, corporate folks, organizations, really no issues there. It's just, I think folks who are students who are at liberty to, they feel like they're at liberty to ask more questions. So yeah, I would say it's a probably 90% positive, and 10%, you know, I think 10% just not understanding yet.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's very helpful to hear that. So I think we can move. We haven't seen any questions, but as Teresa and Mary Margaret have pointed out, like this is really an opportunity to explore. So please feel free to ask your questions. Don't hesitate. This is a very safe space for us to discuss these ideas. And we framed a question, and thank you, Lori, for bringing that up. We just wanted to share, because sometimes it's hard to have a conversation in a large group, and it may be helpful to have some guidelines. And so we think just keeping in mind to respect each other's confidentiality here in this group. If you hear stories here, keep them confidential as you leave. Speak from your personal experience, listen respectfully, seek to understand, and listen harder when you initially disagree. And then trust that through dialogue, we will reach deeper levels of understanding. So with that, I think we can go on to the next question, which is, where do you see design perpetuating elements and patterns of racism in the spaces, artifacts, systems, and experiences of your own life and work? So this is for all of us here in this space to think about. And we thought we'd identify areas of interest, because when you think of a broad question like that, it can be in the context of representation, climate, zoning, and you can read all of the different aspects that the planning team and the presenters here brainstormed as we were preparing for today. So anyone willing to ask or reflect or share in this space? Yeah, thank you, Abby. Please feel free to post to chat if that's easier.
I'm happy to jump in on this one just from my own experience when we hosted the hip hop architecture exhibit Close to the Edge that the AIA St. Paul chapter brought here from the Center for Architecture in New York. It was curated by Sekou Cook and members of our local architecture community from Formula were featured in that exhibit. And I recall being at the unveiling of the exhibit and being with a Black woman who was looking at one of the images in the exhibit, and it showed a relief on the exterior of a building that represented Black women. And she was so moved because she said she'd never seen herself in architecture in that way, truly represented at the forefront and at the entrance of a space. And you think about how many reliefs there are in our built environment and who they represent, who they do not. I think about it too in the context of my family and relatives of mine who are of the LGBTQIA community, and how many of the representations in reliefs and other aspects of architectural spaces represent heterosexual norms, and how rare it is to see the LGBTQIA community represented in the architecture itself, and what a difference it might be to experience spaces in a way that a variety of identities are reflected.
That's a really great point, Mary Margaret. I mean, different communities, as you mentioned, feel invisible, but it's also reflected then in the structures and designs of our built environments and so on. That invisibility is kind of perpetuated. So it's certainly going back to the points that both of you made, is that as we make decisions, as we create, what design is in the future, we have that opportunity to bring that to the table and actually change the systems. Earlier, you talked about we have to change ourselves, and then the idea of culture change as cultivation, and cultivation of these specific opportunities of expression as well. So do we have anyone who would like to either speak to your own experiences, share what you're seeing around design and equity in the
Question.
spaces. Abby, you go
This is
ahead.
Anne here. For Teresa and Mary Margaret, I'm just curious. Teresa, by the way, wonderful projects from your students. And I'm wondering, did you do any pre-surveys with the students and then at the end do a post-survey? I'm just curious if you can share with us some of the changes you've seen, maybe over the years, or even with some of the communities that you've been working with. And I mean, some of the things that you're seeing from your experience, and the same thing for Mary Margaret too. Thank you.
Great question. So when there's like, I could go on and on talking about the toolkit and all the different ways like we engage students, but one of the things that we do is called a journey map. And basically we assign journal entries. And so it is very cool to see what folks thought at the very beginning of the class. And then at the end of the class, they're like, it's everywhere. I can see it here and here and here. And so it's very exciting to see that, but that's one of the ways we get feedback. Also, when we do a workshop, we have feedback at the end as well. And then with the companies that we're working with right now, we meet with them every couple of months and we get feedback in that way. But our toolkit, just the way that design should be in general, is iterative. So if we do get feedback, we are, considering how we can improve the toolkit, because we want this topic to be accessible. But I would say a journey map is the number one thing that we do with our students, and it's proven to be really awesome because even they get to see their own minds shifting and understanding racism from a different way.
So I noticed, Mary Margaret, were you going to respond?
No, I can, but go ahead if there's someone who'd like to jump in.
Actually, there's a couple questions here, so maybe we can go to those. Sean asks, in our engagement with campuses, one of the more interesting questions that we pose to students is, if the campus was empty of its occupants, what would the campus buildings, etc., say about who learns and work there? So another thought. And Sean, if you'd like to add to that verbally, please feel free.
It's always been a great place for us to start the conversation, it seems, because my perspective and perception of that campus is certainly going to be very different than anyone else's experience. And so it's been a nice place to start the conversation, it seemed, about what do these buildings and these artifacts and these grounds represent if you were to remove the people. And it's sometimes very revealing that we have a lot of work to do to make some of those changes.
That's right. They actually embody our histories more firmly than they do our future, right?
Agreed.
Thank you, Sean. Another question from Stephen is, I have recently been running a series or a comment, running a series of webinars and workshops of real estate developers, and Black space has been referenced in almost every session. And it's highlighted for them that the space can be more reflective of communities, space can be Black. And many then realize that most design standards and design best practices are white. I guess it reflects how the people who created them, most often. So
I think absolutely. And I'd say, like, even when you're doing your research, the research part of the design research process, history is racist. So, having that conversation, with folks that we engaging with during the workshop and students, where are you going to get information about, the narratives that you're pulling out from communities? So it is really hard. It's really hard to be like, okay, I'm making something anti-racist, but then all of the things that you get to find are all racist as well. So you really have to change, I think, your thinking, but it is absolutely right that the standard is white.
thank you.
That's why the collaborative process of engaging other people makes the difference, because you are seeing from different lenses, right? So when I think about walking through campus and I think in terms of nature, I really, the buildings are there, but it is the landscape of the trees, the water that speaks to me personally. And then when I see the images that are on materials and posters and digital signage, there are images that I remember from 15 years ago, the same images that keep popping up. And with all of this diversity that takes place on campus, why do we still have those same images when you just take a student, graduated 15 years ago, but that image is still there because it appears to be more comfortable for the individuals who put together the plan on how admissions is marketed, on how other forms of engagement takes place. So the people who are at the table, once again, who are the people at the table having those kinds of conversations? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Serena. It goes back to, again, some of the points that both of you made, Teresa and Mary Margaret, about collaboration, right? So who shapes what happens? So it really speaks to the opportunity of participatory design too, about actually shifting through representation and bringing up ideas, in the process. Mary Margaret?
So when we talk about what equitable design is, especially what equitable development is, it's tough because a lot of the words that we have are around participation or engagement, and they're not quite in that place of centered power, right? So we started to talk about it as community ownership of the vision, the process, the outcome, and the economic benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Who is that community and who owns each aspect of that, as opposed to the idea of engaging, some group in power engaging others or including others, right? And it gets to, I think, what Teresa said about empathy as not quite the concept that we need to be embracing right now as the start of the design process. If you're walking through campus without people there, and you were walking through with being sensitized to be empathic to others who are unlike yourself, you can get, a certain way down the road, but it will never be the same as people who are of those identities walking through the campus and sharing their experiences. So that shift, I think that Teresa put forward is a critical one. And so much of equitable design and development is on the front end of the process. We talk a lot about climate-oriented design, sustainable, regenerative design, having first costs. The first costs of equitable development are all on the front end. And unless you get that stuff right and really invest there, you're going to miss the mark at all the other places that follow in the process.
Thank you, Mary Margaret. So Dick, I saw you unmute a couple times. Sorry, it's taken a while.
Well, thank you. Just trying to build on Mary Margaret's point, and I think, I've had the luxury of being both the architect for a number of public corporate buildings, as well as being a client on the client side of a series of governmental buildings. And there are two challenges here. One is architects. Have we really built the team that's rich enough in experience, diverse enough in our perspectives and so on to be appropriate for the project? And then I think we often give too much the client across the table. The client we have the contract with maybe isn't really the real client. The real client is really the broader community. And we have the responsibility, I believe, as the design team leaders, perhaps, or at least one of the team members, how do we encourage the client to really broaden their own view of who the client is for their project? Who really belongs there at the meeting if it's a school? who really belongs there if it's an apartment house. And I think we could do a great deal more to stretch the client of record's view of who the client is in terms of the broader community. How do we behave more like public health doctors and not private practice doctors?
That's a great comment. Teresa and Mary Margaret, any thoughts on clients?
Just as you're talking, like anytime I talk about racism, it always boils down to capitalism. And so when I think about like, how do we begin to inform clients? My business, my design studio, Blackbird Revolt, we're not going to work with you unless you have the same values that we have. So what this is going to require, if people actually want to begin to make change, is they're going to have to begin to turn down clients who are not listening to them about inequity and about racism and about sexism. But are we willing to do that? As a discipline, as designers, are we willing to say, okay, I'm not going to take this dollar so that, because they're, they don't stand for what I stand for. So, for me, it's very easy. I think it's because I live in the body that I do, and I just don't have time to negotiate my identity. And if my life matters, so I, can say no to something very quickly. But other folks who have that privilege, who are, it's not going to be life or death for you. Are you willing to stand as an ally and say, no, I'm not going to take this job because you all are, perpetuating racism and you're unwilling to change? So I think it's up to us. We have the power if we're working with the client, but a lot of us don't speak up when it's needed.
Mary Margaret, did you want to add anything? I think we can't. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I've got dogs and children in the background. No, I think the question, Dick raises a great point. And I think Teresa's approach is one that I'm starting to see signs that more and more architecture firms are thinking seriously about who their clients are and where that line is for them, of what is the work that they are willing to walk away from. And that's not historically the way the profession has tended to operate. So it does get to a broader concern that I've had, and this goes beyond architecture. I was reading the column in the Star Tribune the day of the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. And various government officials and nonprofit leaders and corporate leaders were reflecting on the past year and talking about what they had learned and what they had done differently. And so much of it was focused on that they had listened more and they had read more. But what I didn't hear about was what they had changed about the systems that they have power to change. And that was really disheartening for me. So I think the sensibility has been raised, the intentions are stronger and more aligned, but unless those intentions, as Teresa was mentioning, are turn into impact, are focused on outcomes and actually changing the way we operate, each of us, we're not going to get there. We're certainly not going to get there fast.
Yeah, if I can add one more thing from what I've been learning from the campus diversity work, Dick, is that sometimes we approach the equity and diversity work as though it is outside of ourselves. It's out there, it's a project, it's something we're fixing. And what Mary Margaret said in her presentation, we have to change ourselves, then really starts to connect to the fact that it's not disconnected. We're working on ourselves even as we're sort of changing or creating something new outside. And many people are not ready to go there. So even with the client question, right, they see it as something that is added on. And I would argue that architects and designers have dealt with it in different ways. I mean, when it comes to standards of aesthetics and beauty, we've figured out a way to sort of surface that and hold on to what we think true. Certainly around climate and sustainability, I've seen more in the last couple decades of moving more and more to say that this is of value and educating the client. And I think this has been a long time coming, but equity work is similarly, like you adopt it as your own value, work on yourselves, as well as then educate your clients and make hard choices when you have to, So I think we're getting close to our time here before we close out. Any additional questions? Thank you, Stephen, for sharing some resources for us. Oh, there is one question here, Theodore. Do you have any examples of architecture spaces, not images within them, that are intentionally or not racist? I guess for me, campuses, for example, embody colonized, architecture, colonizing architecture. And that's one specific model that you can see across the nation and beyond. So I think it embodies a particular kind of history and ways of operating. That's what comes to mind. Anyone else? Mary Margaret and Teresa.
Well, I'm not quite sure if the person with the question is asking for specific architectural, specific buildings. But I think very much what you've noted is what are the overall styles of buildings and campuses and landscapes, and from what do they derive? What's the context historically? And if that context is rooted in colonization, if the styles of buildings are more reminiscent of plantation houses than not, there are different impacts that you're going to have for different individuals being in that space. And I am by no means an expert in architecture. I have spent a lot of time understanding the members of the profession, and I would defer to my colleagues for whom this is their life's work to identify specific buildings and how architectural styles evolve over time or hold on to historical styles for the purpose, whether intentionally or not, of perpetuating certain views of power and who holds power.
Right. It goes back to also a point you were making earlier, Mary Margaret, about the, sculpture displays, friezes and so on. We've had on one of our campuses, for example, just a mural that depicts Native Americans in a very, in this sort of romanticized, and inappropriate ways. And that's under examination, and we're, figuring out the best way to kind of move from that. So those are examples. Like that space, when you enter that space, immediately it sort of brings up this question for anyone who is getting more aware or aware of equity issues, that, what does it embody? And to have students then actually be educated in that space is deeply problematic. Hope that helps.
The other thing I would say is that the realm of, I'm sorry, just very briefly, the realm of appropriation, right? One of the sort of ways that I've recognized that architects and their collaborators can try to make a space seem inclusive is what one of the other folks in the audience referenced earlier, sort of banners placed on campus that have an individual representing each of the primary racial groups within this nation, affixed to a building to say all are welcome here. If we just slap this thing on over here, that's not actually how it works. And so that's where the more fundamental rethinking, as opposed to this sort of additive approach that doesn't ask the harder questions, make the harder decisions around spaces, is where we need to go. Sorry, Teresa.
No, I was gonna say, when I think about a particular space, I was just, I saw a presentation by one of the designers who worked on the African American Museum in DC. And yet I think that that definitely is an example of, you know, a building and architectural structure that could be considered anti-racist based on all of the processes that they thought about when making the building, where the windows were, like, you know, very, very cool stuff. However, one thing I think we forget as designers is that, like, man, I guess system is the word that I'm looking for, but, you know, we could have a really beautiful building that is, you know, anti-racist in its structure. But if I go in there and there's only white people in there, you know, it's perpetuating racism. I don't feel comfortable. The same thing with the, you know, the problematic, you know, poster says, "All are welcome here." But if you only have 90% white students on your campus, no, I am not welcome here. And so there, it, like, the structure, yes, very important, but also it works in a huge system. And I think people are not willing to, like, make their design iterative and consider all of those things when thinking about, like, an anti-racist structure. So that's what I think about, is, like, you know, it could, the building could be great, but, like, you know, who's working there? You know, who's in charge? Like, who, you know, what kind of artwork do we have on the walls? You know, so I feel like it's a bigger issue than just, like, you know, where does this brick go?
Thank you so much. I see that we're at time. I really wanted to thank our presenters for a wonderful, deep discussion of this topic. So where do we go from here is the question before all of us. I think each of us has something to take away from today's discussion and bring to our own work. And I encourage you to do that. So please join me on thanking Teresa and Mary Margaret. And also we will be sending out resources that are listed here in a follow-up email. And I'm going to turn it to Lori for any last comments before we part ways. But thank you so much for being here. Lori?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So watch for my email after this event. I'll share a link to the video along with all of the chat notes and great resources that you've shared, and some of the ones here on this screen. And we'll be planning some more discussions in this series for fall 2021. So you can keep an eye out for that. And as a past participant, you'll get notice when those are on the schedule. So we look forward to seeing you again soon. And thanks for joining us this season.
Thank you. Bye-bye.